Hey, good morning, everybody. So, I literally just spilled pasta sauce all over my computer mouse setting this whole thing up. I hate how klutzy I am sometimes. And the noodles themselves sucked. So it wasn't even worth the mess. I thought I was treating myself to, dinner for breakfast, pasta in the AM. Anywho, I don't follow sports all that much anymore, but I happened to come across something ridiculous. The Cleveland Browns, a professional NFL football team, just fired/released one of their players named Lonnie Phelps after a DUI arrest. Okay, cool. Repercussions for his actions. Makes sense. But then I remembered the Browns is the same organization that hired Deshaun Watson after 26 women came forward saying they experienced sexual misconduct or sexual assault at the hands of Watson. Then they proceeded to give this man $230 million over 5 years, knowing what kind of person he is. Allegedly, he's paid out over $30 million in roughly 24 of the 26 settlements to these women and received an 11-game suspension or some bullshit. But oh no, draw the moral line at a drunk driver, not the possible/probable serial rapist. I don't get it. Protecting an abuser so they can be good at football. Yay. Do better, Browns. Okie dokie. We are headed way back in time today for a story I've never come across before. Today, I bring you Surviving the Torture House. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today come from a CBS article and a very old newspaper. As you can tell by how long this episode is, it will be a shorter I couldn't find more than essentially 2 columns worth of information without paying to get past some sort of paywall. From the Bobby Frank and Lindbergh kidnappings to notorious child serial killer Albert Fish, the 1920s held a huge prevalence in the world of crime. And while these cases took the world by storm, many others were seemingly swept under the rug, and forgotten about. Saturday night in Louisville, Kentucky, on March 8th of 1924, a man by the name of William Gates rushed into the police station, disheveled, clothes missing, and a pair of handcuffs dangling from his wrists. If you had seen this man anywhere else, you might assume he had just escaped from a police station. As detectives approached this huffing and puffing man, he began to tell a story that no one in the room would ever forget. Quote, William Gates, who was an ex-serviceman, had been married to a girl of prominent parentage in Louisville, Kentucky, shortly after being discharged from the service. His young wife died only 6 months into their marriage, and from then, Gates had to leave and move to Detroit. Just get away from it all. There, he accepted employment with the Procter & Gamble Company. Not much is said about this time in his life. All I could find is that he was a salesman. Gates soon left and then took up residence in Logansport, Indiana in June of 1922 after being appointed head salesman for the district of Logansport, working his way up through the ranks. And by 1923, William Gates was ready to move back to Louisville and amicably split with his employer, Procter & Gamble. Like I said, his life details are few and far between, but he did end up remarrying here in Louisville. Grew up in Kentucky, left for Indiana, made his way back to Louisville, Kentucky. Here, he either met or already knew a man named Richard Heaton, and soon the two went into business together. Whatever success or failures their business saw was quickly overshadowed by what happened next. You see, Richard Heaton, a married man, had always been a controlling, jealous partner, suspicious of every friend, every acquaintance, every person who talked to his wife, Mr. Gates being one of said acquaintances. Heaton was positive his wife and now new business partner were having an affair on the side, and he couldn't take it. Now, the plan he puts into action does not make sense. I read that newspaper clipping like 30 times over, but between the faded lines, ancient jargon, and awful column placement, it hurt my brain and I simply failed to piece it together 100%, but I'm going to do my best. On February 20th, 1924, Mr. Richard Heaton entered the William J. Turner Detective Agency. He was asking for help. I'm almost positive I've spoken about this agency before. It had quite the name back in the day. Richard Heaton spoke with detective or operative, as they called her, Jenny E. Moore, that morning. She told the newspaper later, quote, Mr. Heaton came to the agency on February 20th. He identified himself as Police Officer Rivers. He claimed he wanted a woman operative to aid him in a case against a former employee who had absconded with money. This is all a fabricated story, of course. She continues, I went to Louisville and I stayed at the Brown Hotel on February 25th. I met Mr. Heaton a short distance from the hotel and he took me to his home. There, Mrs. Heaton and I were instantly tied up and practically held prisoners until last Saturday night. He instructed me to answer the phone and to keep Mrs. Gates from getting in communication with Mrs. Heaton. He acted like a crazy man. He had one revolver in a shoulder holster and another on his hip. I knew something was terribly wrong, but was afraid he'd kill me if I tried to get away. End quote. Right off the bat, the plan doesn't make sense. He's trying to get revenge on Mr. Gates and maybe his wife, but has only managed to kidnap her and a random detective. Days later, as the woman suffered, Heaton finally decided to make his move on William Gates, and he convinced a scumbag friend / police detective, Frank Cordell, to help him. On March 6th, Gates was at his office, the one that he shared with Heaton, when two men suddenly burst through the door. Recognizing one of the men, Gates wasn't immediately worried until they started to drag him through the door. Cordell and Heaton tied Mr. Gates up and brought him to another house that was prepped for that night. Whose house? It didn't say, but I'm thinking either Frank Cordell's or another sketchy friend of theirs. Quote, preparations were made to operate on him immediately by Heaton, who procured a funnel with cotton and poured chloroform in it, which was held to Gates' nostrils. Before he passed out, Gates began to mumble, and while doing so, said that he gave instruction to his aunt in Logansport to be notified if anything were to happen to him. This clearly scared Heaton and gave Gates a short reprieve, and later, when he was back to full consciousness, was forced to call his aunt by phone, again fabricating a cover story, saying he was leaving the town. Richard's plans for an immediate operation were suspended because of this, and Gates lay bound and handcuffed for 2 days under guard. Gates recalled that while being taken to the bathroom, his handcuffs were removed and he suddenly remembered an old type revolver which he had concealed on his person and which Heaton had overlooked in his search. Instantly, he fired 2 shots at Heaton and ran, end quote. A neighboring physician heard the shots and arrived to find Mr. Heaton dead, alone on the floor. The plan doesn't make sense. Richard's actions don't make sense. And I'm sorry I don't have all the answers. It's unclear when, but at some point, before Gates escaped, or as he escaped, so did the 2 women. They managed to free themselves after 10-ish days in captivity. Why they were ever tied up? Beyond me. Thankfully, they got out as well. Gates ran straight to the police to report his own kidnapping. Still with handcuffs in tow. Police were initially skeptical, holding Gates on a murder charge himself, but soon Frank Cordell spilled the beans and would corroborate this story. After weeks of planning and executing this disastrous revenge/blackmail scheme/operation, Heaton would be the only person to lose anything. His jealousy backfiring most beautifully. Well, I suppose Mrs. Heaton lost her husband, but that was probably for the best. And that, my friends, is the bewildering, confusing kidnapping of William Gates, Mrs. Heaton, and Jenny E. Moore. I really tried to, not drag that story out, but find more information to layer between. But dang, I just couldn't find anything out there, like I said, without paying for it. For example, what sort of operation had Heaton planned while he was knocked unconscious? Was it actually a blackmail scheme, or was it simply plot for murder? I'm positive we'll never know exactly. It's just another example of you never truly know somebody. I hope you guys enjoyed that one, short as it was. As always, if you'd like, stick around after the music for a bonus bit. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. We have got an exciting update to round off today's episode, and hopefully this discovery will lead to many more in the near future. Titled 1996 Cold Case Killings of Two Campers at Shenandoah National Park Solved, of CBS News. Nearly 3 decades after 2 young women were found with their throats slashed in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park, federal authorities announced Thursday that they have identified a now-deceased serial rapist from Ohio as the person they believe responsible for the killings. The bodies of Julie Williams, who was 24, and her partner Laura Winans, who was 26, were found bound and gagged at their campsite in the park in 1996. The killing sent a wave of fear through the LGBTQ+ community, but the FBI said during a news conference Thursday that there is no evidence that the women were targeted because of their sexual orientation. The long unsolved killings were reviewed by a new investigative team starting in 2021. Recently, a private lab pulled DNA from several pieces of evidence from the crime scene and sent the genetic profile to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, which is a database used by law enforcement to match DNA to suspects. They got a positive match to Walter, aka Leo Jackson Sr., a convicted rapist originally from Cleveland, Ohio. They said the FBI then got DNA from the original swab taken from Jackson when he was charged in another rape in Ohio, which confirmed the match. He said the recent DNA testing found there is only a 1 in 2.6 trillion chance that the DNA found at the crime scene came from somebody else other than Jackson. This week, FBI officials were able to tell the families of these 2 women who they believe committed the killings. Jackson, who worked as a house painter, died in prison in 2018 in Cuyahoga County, Ohio. He was 70 years old. He had served at least 4 separate prison terms after being convicted of kidnapping and multiple rapes and assaults. The recent retesting of crime scene evidence showed that both Williams and Winans were sexually assaulted. But they said they found no evidence that Jackson knew of their sexual orientation or targeted them for that reason. Make no mistake, this crime was brutal. This crime was definitely hateful. Nevertheless, we do not have any evidence that the crime was motivated by anti-gay bias. No matter how long it takes, we don't give up, said U.S. Attorney for Western District yada in Virginia, Christopher Kavanaugh. If he were alive today, we would seek a single defendant indictment charging Walter Leo Jackson with these crimes. Authorities were vague when asked whether the same DNA testing could have been done years ago and identified the suspect earlier. They're like, maybe, could have been. In 2001, authorities arrested another man in the killings, Daryl David Rice, a computer programmer from Maryland, and he was charged with capital murder. Rice had pleaded guilty earlier in 1998 in the attempted abduction of a female bicyclist he tried to force into his truck, also in Shenandoah National Park. He was serving an 11-year prison sentence when he was charged with the killing of Williams and Winans, but these charges were eventually dropped after forensic testing showed that the hairs found at the crime scene completely ruled him out as a suspect. Williams, who was from St. Cloud, Minnesota, and Winans, who grew up in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, were both experienced hikers and were passionate about environmental issues. They were hiking with a golden retriever named Taj when they were last seen by a park employee on May 24, 1996. Their bodies were discovered on June 1st of 1996 at their campsite near Skyline Resort. The FBI is continuing to work with other law enforcement agencies to determine if Jackson is responsible for other unsolved crimes. They said, "Our investigation will not stop here." End quote. I mean, he has to be responsible for other unsolved crimes, right? The amount of time he had, the amount of space in Shenandoah National Park, and the amount of tourists going in and out daily. It couldn't have been a one and done. It never is, right? Well, that is all I have for you folks today. Thank you once again for hanging out a bit, listening in, having whatever, learning a little bit with me. I truly do appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you on Thursday. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you.